Welcome to What Lies Beyond with your host, Matt Coburn. Conversations on consciousness science, the paranormal, and the post-material future. This podcast accompanies the What Lies Beyond book by Matt Coburn, now available for pre-order on Amazon and other retail outlets. Visit us and subscribe on whatliesbeyond.substack.com. Today, my guest is Professor Christine Simmonds-Moore. Christine earned her Ph.D. in psychology from the University of Northampton in the UK. In 2010, she left her native UK for the USA. Christine worked as a senior research fellow at the Rhine Research Center in Durham, North Carolina, until she moved to Carrollton in 2011 to join the psychology department at the University of West Georgia. Her research interests include the study of personality types who are prone to subjective anomalous and paranormal experiences, synesthesia, anomalous experiences, and sleep-related altered states of consciousness. Recent research has focused on the roles of the body in anomalous experience. She is currently working on a Bial-funded project about aphantasia, that is, people who have a lack of visual mental imagery. She is the editor of Exceptional Experience and Health, Essays on Mind, Body and Human Potential, and a co-author of a textbook on anomalistic psychology. Today, we have an in-depth discussion on the relationship between paranormal experience and what Christine calls the transliminal mind. We discuss the psychological dimensions of anomalous experience and their relationship to certain specific personality types. We discuss the evidence for psi phenomena, and we talk about possible future directions for parapsychology and consciousness studies. Christine, I'm trying to remember when we first met. I think it might have been at that SPR thing with Bob Morris, and I think you were doing your PhD at Northampton.
Yeah, it's definitely when I was doing my PhD at Northampton, and probably through some of the SPR events, because at the time there was a group of us that were connecting as emerging parapsychologists who were doing PhDs or academic interests in parapsychology, and we would meet up at various SPR events and study days. So definitely around that time.
Yes, brilliant. And I think that must have been around 1998 or 1999, I think, probably.
Yes, I think so. Yes, because I started my PhD in 1998, I think. Yes, I did. And yes, so it would have been around then or like 99 for sure. Yeah.
So what was the subject matter of your PhD, and how did you get into? Well, tell us a little bit about what the subject matter was, how you got interested in that subject matter, and what made you want to do a PhD in sort of parapsychology related areas.
Yeah, so my PhD is on exploring schizotypy as an anomaly-prone personality, and it came about because I've always been interested in parapsychology. I suppose I didn't know for a while that it was actually a legitimate academic discipline. I just always felt that I had a personal interest in parapsychological phenomena, and I suppose it was happening around me. My mum and my sister had experiences I didn't really have many strong parapsychological experiences, but I did have unusual experiences, and I had an interest. There was a group of us at school in the sixth form who were really interested in parapsychology. We just connected about ghost stories, and I just remember a few of us talking about them and even talking about them in French because it's just our little nerdy group. Um, and then one of us, a friend, lived in the Grove Mill cottage, which is apparently haunted. And I just remember her stories about her mum seeing a ghost of a maid and how the maid would just walk down a corridor and then walk through the wall. And I use that in the classroom now because I think it's a really good example of some types of haunting experience. And I was always fascinated by that. I was always finding books on paranormal experiences at secondhand bookshops and book fairs and collecting things. But again, didn't know there was actual academic research behind it at the beginning that was legitimate. So then I did my undergraduate in psychology at Swansea. And I remember as well browsing in the psychology section in the library, and there was a whole section of journals I can see in my mind's eye now that were purple, the Journal of Parapsychology. But they seemed to stop in the 1970s. And again, that sort of fed into my understanding that this, there's something to this, but it stopped. And I got into that because I was doing my third year research project on the hypnagogic state of consciousness. And in my research for this, I realized that hypnagogia, which is the state of consciousness in between wakefulness and sleep, is a really conducive time to these kind of experiences, to ghost type phenomena and to other psychic experiences. And so I was, and not directly studying those kind of components in my writing for my undergraduate research project, but went down the rabbit hole and was quite excited that this was a rich time for these experiences too. So anyway, I later found out that Hansel had been at Swansea and he was a famous skeptic in parapsychology. So that was quite interesting. But I'm grateful to my time at Swansea because I was able to get into consciousness studies. I suppose through studying sleep and dreams, particularly hypnagogia. And at the time, I just really loved research. I really realized that I wanted to do a PhD. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do a PhD on, but definitely knew that I wanted to do something on consciousness. And I really think it's so valuable to be able to do that as an undergrad. So I spent a year looking at hypnagogia and, looking at hypnagogia and correlates. And also I had people wired up to an EEG and I was looking at how people's mentation shifted as they fell asleep. And it was so interesting. And I think I got a little bit obsessed with it, which is a repeating pattern in my life with my research projects. But anyway, so those are the seeds of the interest, I suppose, like that is always part of me. I've seen experiences around me. I've read about experiences, and then I'm just, just always had an interest in consciousness. And then I was going to do a PhD at Bangor University. I moved to North Wales. This is after doing a master's in Dundee in cognitive science. I only did that because I saw that there was dreams on the books, and I went to do this cognitive science master's because of the dreams. And I'm just, again, fascinated with dreams. And so I suppose it wasn't really what I would have chosen if I would go back and do it again, but you can't, you can't change the past, and it led, me to where I am now. So after the master's, I was going to do this PhD in North Wales and realized that really that wasn't, I didn't want to do the PhD that I was going to be doing. It wasn't quite right. And, but I got opportunities to read into lots of areas of parapsychological correlates again and started discovering as I was in Wales about the construct of schizotypy. I think Jackson was there, and like one of my fellow people who was a TA, my friends, was doing something on positive schizotypy. and I got hold of the book by Claridge, 1997, I think it came out, and I was just blown away by the chapter on schizotypy and spiritual experience that was in there. I think there's one by Jackson, there's another chapter by McCreary, or McCreary's ideas about schizotypy and micro sleeps. And I started thinking about that and parapsychological experiences. Anyway, so I started getting into this, and at the same time, I discover in North Wales there's a evening class on parapsychology by this local guy called Robert Turner, who was friends with Bob Morris in Edinburgh. So you mentioned Bob Morris before. And I went along to this evening class, and I was just so excited that it was a thing called parapsychology, that was an academic discipline, and that it was at a university in Britain. Like, oh my God, this is amazing. And so, but Turner was immediately inspiring to me, and he was like, you have to do a PhD. I said, I do have to do a PhD. He was like, well, write to Bob Morris. And so he encouraged me to write to Bob. So I started pestering Bob Morris, and Bob Morris was amazing. And he was telling me to look into funding sources so I could get to, do a PhD. And he's like, read up about it, put together a proposal, and think about going to the SPR conference, and talk to people, talk to people that you might have an interest in talking to about parapsychology. Just don't be afraid. Just go and just mingle. That's probably not his exact words, but I did go to that conference, and it was at Brighton, and I met amazing people who were my people. Immediately, I feel like parapsychologists are my people. Immediately, I go to this conference, I'm like, this is my thing. And it was at that conference I met Paul Stevens, I met Susan Blackmore, I met Bob Morris there again. Were you there? Maybe you were there.
No, I wasn't, but I did hear about it because I think
Yeah.
one of our mutual friends was there as well, and he mentioned it. Was that a joint one with the PA as well?
Yeah, it was Espoir
Yeah,
BA.
just missed that one.
Yeah, and it was at Brighton, and and I'd never been to Brighton before, and I thought Brighton was amazing, and I just was blown away by this conference. Oh, and I met Richard Harrison, and Simon Sherwood, I think, was there, and everybody was telling me about this thing called the SSP, and I was like, what? What's the SSP? And that's the summer study program in parapsychology at the Rhine Research Center, and they were telling me about how amazing it was, and it was a 2-month program, and I should try and go. And I was like, okay, sounds really cool. Also, at that conference, I heard whispers of a PhD studentship at Northampton that was going to be with Chris Rowe, who'd done his PhD with Bob Morris. And I was like, wow, that sounds really cool. I really want to go to Edinburgh, but that sounds really interesting. And then I kept hearing about this studentship, and it came to me 3 times. I forget like where I kept coming across it, and everyone kept telling me about this studentship. I'm like, okay, I have to apply to this. This sort of feels like it's my destiny, or I'm going to make it my destiny. It felt so right. It felt like a big struggle to, I suppose, get into parapsychology, but it felt so absolutely right that when I was putting the thing together, it just felt like everything was just falling into place, and that I needed to go to study at Northampton, even though Northampton wasn't Edinburgh. And I was applying for other PhDs too, and I had an interview for one at Leeds, I think, and it was about sleep deprivation and performance. So I was still interested in sleep states and consciousness, but I really wanted to do a PhD on parapsychology. And I just ended up, pulling together my proposal that I'd started working on when I was still living in North Wales, on the correlates of paranormal experiences. And so in the proposal, I was looking at schizotypy and temporal lobe lability, but also bringing in gender role and how all those things kind of interacted with regard to paranormal experiences. And that's what I was proposing. And I kept pestering Northampton because I really, really wanted this. And eventually I was offered the studentship. And so I moved to Northampton to start this studentship. And I was really, 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 really excited about it. And I did get to go on the SSP because I had to propose specific training in parapsychology, well, specific training that would help me do my PhD. And so I said, oh, I think I need to go to study at the Rhine Research Center on this SSP. And so off I went in the summer. Wow, that was the summer of 1998, June
Brilliant.
1998.
So, just quickly, the Rhine Research was set up by J.B. Rhine, who kicked off experimental parapsychology in the 30s with listeners might have seen Zener cards, sort of cards with specific patterns on, and they did a lot of those sort of tests in the 30s, and that's where that center came from, isn't it? But tell me a little bit more about what schizotypy is, because it sounds similar to schizophrenia, which doesn't necessarily have positive associations. So tell me what the difference is between those two terms.
Well, they are related, and I think there is a movement towards reclaiming what schizotypy is and normalizing it. So um, there are certain traits that are probably also visible in aspects of schizophrenia, but the idea of looking at schizotypy as a trait is that there might be watered down aspects of thinking and perception and feelings that are trait-like, but can also be useful in some ways. So the idea of a trait is that it's a personality attribute rather than a deficit. So it's not the case that it's exactly the same as schizophrenia, but there are echoes of some of the traits. And schizotypy is a complex construct, as is schizophrenia, very, very complex. Schizotypy, we know that there are 4 different types of schizotypy that do kind of overlap with 4 different types of schizophrenia as well. The most interesting one for parapsychologists is positive schizotypy. And positive schizotypy is where people might have anomalous perceptions and hallucination proneness and things like that, meaning making. And so you can see how that might kind of align with some of the things you might see in a more pathological situation. But there's lots of evidence that on its own, like traits that are behind positive schizotypy, as measured as a trait, are very oftentimes beneficial for people. Not always, though. So we can't look at personality scale on its own. You have to think about how it works with, with other factors. So with the schizotypy construct, you've also got negative schizotypy, which does kind of have similarities to negative schizophrenia. So that's kind of where people might have emotional flatness and social withdrawal. So there's that. But we also have another type of schizotypy called cognitive disorganization that also relates to sort of schizophrenic disorganization. And so at the sort of watered down levels, that might look like social anxiety and also just a disorganization of thoughts and attention, I think. Yes, and there's also a 4th one, but like some people don't agree that there's a 4th one, which is about manic tendencies and impulsivity.
So just to try and bring this to something fairly concrete. So I mean, when I talk to people, sort of witnesses of, say, paranormal events or paranormal experiences, there does seem to be a subtype of person who has, say, paranormal type experiences all the time. So they might say, "Oh, I see ghosts all the time," or "I have apparently telepathic experiences or precognitive experiences," and otherwise they appear to be very healthy.
Mm-hmm.
But there does seem to be a difference between people who have these sorts of experiences very commonly and those who maybe say, "I have never had an apparently psychical paranormal experience." Do you think that's fair? And do you think there might be a spectrum?
Yes, there's definitely a spectrum. Yeah. So the tendencies to have parapsychological experiences do correlate really strongly with how people score on scales like positive schizotypy. But I'll also say there's other scales that are have nicer language that are doing something similar, like transliminality, for example, Hartman's boundary thinness, and even temporal ability to a certain extent. Those things do. So yeah, I think there is definitely a relationship between having certain traits, and I can talk about that in a minute, like what they look like, because I said hallucination proneness and proneness to unusual experiences more generally. People, some people are wired. I say it that way. They're wired to be able to have experiences more than others. So that doesn't mean that somebody who scores low on the scale might never have an experience, because there are certain circumstances that might sort of influence the system to push it to have, to act in a similar way to what happens in people who are wired to have experiences more commonly. But then, yeah, so there are certain circumstances that might do that for people who otherwise would be going around saying, I don't understand because this doesn't happen. There's definitely a strong relationship, but then humans are humans, and so there's no such thing as a perfect correlation with humans. But yeah, so somebody who is more likely to have a paranormal experience, like, or have them more constantly, might be more likely to have this kind of system. And the system is characterized by having more connections. And that's the kind of very simple way of saying it. There's more interconnectivity, more fluidity in terms of the physical systems, and in terms of the psychological systems, and then in terms of how the person might interact with social others and the environment, and even the potentially non-local world as well. So the way that they're wired is fluid. And so there's a greater tendency to connect information, and there's more of a porousness between what's usually conscious and what's preconscious and unconscious, including information that might be held in the body. There's much more of an awareness of more in people who are sort of more, I'll say transliminal, because it's a nicer term than positive schizotypy. But I like positive schizotypy because of this kind of the existence of these other types that might sort of affect how healthy somebody is, because the health part is important for
Yes, definitely.
for understanding what's going on. Because you might have experiences and be very healthy, and you might have a proneness to experiences and have more difficulty. And so that's useful. The other types of schizotypy are useful to understand sort of the healthy aspects versus less healthy aspects.
You use a phrase in your work which I really like. It's liminal minds. And you were saying that I'll just look at my notes here. There's sort of different levels of that. So like you're saying, the sort of the brain levels, sort of neurobiology and cognitive, but also interpersonal as well, and sort of psychological.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really very interesting. And also that you bring in not just paranormal experience, but also what's known as transpersonal and mystical experience. So
Yeah.
this is where people experience, well, many things, but say they're in nature and then they suddenly feel this intense interconnectedness with the
Yeah.
natural world. And I really like the way that you bring all of that together.
Yeah, I mean, I think they are connected, and I think parapsychology can learn a lot from transpersonal psychology and vice versa. But we also do need to be dialoguing with the mainstream and looking at what we can learn from these different areas in terms of understanding these different ways of being. So yeah, I think that we do need to look at the correlates of unusual experiences, exceptional experiences from multiple levels. And I talk about intrapersonal connectivity, interpersonal connectivity, and then extrapersonal connectivity, which I think you can see them playing out at these various levels. And then what I'm looking at now is, like, to what extent do the different levels speak to each other? Can you encourage certain types of connectivity by boosting others? And I think there is some evidence for that, but we need to look more at the psi research with that idea. How can we boost these kind of types of connectivity? But yeah, so I use liminality and connectivity because I think they're similar. because what you end up with is people who are more in liminal spaces, so able to kind of be in both places at once. I think that's a good way to say it. It's not black and white thinking, it's shades of grey. There's shades of grey, and shades of grey are liminal. It's not binary. It's in a space in between. And so we can also bring in metaphors of fractals, but not just metaphors, because I think fractals have a lot to tell us about that kind of liminal way of being. And so people who have more of these connections are going to be more prone to having access to more, because they're going to be in, I suppose, multiple places at once. That's one way to look at it, because the boundaries are not fixed. Because everybody likes to look at the world and see clear boundaries between things, but actually reality isn't as bounded as it might seem. But if we start thinking about individual differences, I think some people are more boundaried than others, and that can even be understood from a more physiological perspective. Their systems are more pruned, and the nervous systems and ways of thinking are more linear, whereas for people in liminal states and people who are psychometrically more liminal, that everything is much more fluid and interconnected anyway. So they're in multiple places at once. I'm not saying one's best than the other, because I think this is a danger in this kind of thinking too. That ends up being put into binaries as well, because people are like, oh, you're saying this is good and this is bad. No, because I think both ways of thinking are valuable for humans. We need logical, rational thinking, and we need fluid, interconnected thinking in order to flourish as humans. We need both, which is a transpersonal position, I think, too.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember from when I first met you, you were very influenced by, I think it was Ernest Hartman's book,
Yeah.
Boundaries in the Mind, which is all that he started off researching nightmares, didn't he? So, and it led to this idea of people who have thick and thin boundaries. So you sort of alluded to that. So could you just say get a little bit more about what the difference is what's the difference between someone with thick boundaries and someone with thin boundaries?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite topics, and it's kind of what I'm alluding to with how people are thinking in the world, and how some people are very much more binary in their thinking and other people are more fluid. So, a thin boundary person, and again, it's most of us are probably somewhere in the middle with a mixture of thinness and thickness, and we can move around as well, but people tend to be one way or the other. So a thinner boundary person would experience the world as more interconnected, and they would experience much more in between states of consciousness. They would connect thoughts and feelings a little bit more, and they would be more prone to having synesthetic type thinking and other syncretic cognition. They would get closer to other people, um, feel like their sense of self might blur into another person, for example, and they might feel more influenced by some aspects of the physical world as well, which is kind of getting more into the construct of transliminality, but it's very, very similar. But there's a porousness in somebody who's thinner boundaried. I also want to say that I think that there are thin boundaried states. So kind of harking back to the you mentioned hypnagogia before. So hypnagogia is a state that is more fluid anyway, and we've got much more of a tendency to have these kind of interconnections of thought. Whereas, like when we're focused and awake, we might be generally more linear in our thinking and more like a thick boundaried person. But when we talk about these personality traits, it's about how people tend to be in the world. So you've got some fluidness and movement, but some people tend to be much more, okay, things are separate. They see things as more separate and clear cut and linear. A leads to B leads to C if you're thicker boundaried, whereas a thinner boundaried person would be like, oh, A leads to B, leads to C, leads to Z, leads to W. It's about creativity as well. And again, like not saying that a thick boundary person can't be creative, but there's just, again, different types of creativity. And you need both ways of thinking, even for creativity, because you need to have fluidity. And then you need to kind of focus in on like how you might use a certain thing. You have to capture something. So, I mean, ultimately, you do need to have both ways of thinking, but we do see, uh, with regard to their exceptional experiences, people who are more generally fluid and more boundary thin will be more prone to having the full range of paranormal experiences, but also uh, more likely to also experience transpersonal phenomena and perhaps mystical experiences and awakening experiences. And they might also be more sensitive to certain altered state induction procedures.
Yeah, everything you're saying, it really resonates because I've been reviewing some of the literature on sort of cross-cultural literature on shamanism. And so, for examples, I would imagine shamans would tend to be thin-bounded, and quite often, interestingly, it's not just sort of sort of psychological states. It's also that they live on the edge of settlements. They live on the edge, on the boundary between the forest and sort of human habitation, and actually liminality was, I think, initially a anthropological concept. I've talked about that with Jack Hunter earlier on one of these podcasts. So it's all linked, isn't it?
Absolutely, it's all linked. And so you do see people taking liminal positions in society as being prone to these kind of experiences as well. You see it going in terms of social structures, but also, physical, environmental locations too. Absolutely. We cannot remove the social and the environmental from these experiences either because they're all connected. So it's probably easier for somebody who is more fluid oftentimes to live at the edges in many ways, in terms of social structures, but in terms of environmental liminal spaces, certain places are going to be more encouraging of those kind of experiences. So certain green spaces are particularly conducive to people getting into relaxed states, for example, like the color green is really powerful in terms of making us relax. Just as simple as that, just the color green. And that's like not even thinking about the living nature of nature, like the fact that you can feel that some places are more alive than others. And then the fractals, because natural places have more fractals in them than man-made places. So fractals and fractal imagery is also influential, I think, in and there's evidence for that too, in how we might be. So people prefer fractal imagery, and fractal imagery makes you more relaxed, and creative works of art are more fractal-like. And there is some relationship as well between fractals and fractal states and the states that are interesting and conducive to psi experiences. So again, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I've been getting into this literature because I've been writing about fractals lately. But it does seem like there are certain states, including REM sleep, meditation, psychedelic states, where you've got more of a richness of fractals, or fractal structures are emerging. And fractals, rich fractal states, are those that are also supposed to be more healthy. So it kind of gets around to that as well. So if you have less fractals, like, you might be, less of a healthy system. There's a kind of flourishing associated with a richness of fractals too. Anyway, that might be a big tangent, but it is all
No, not at all. Not at all. It makes me. I mean, I think I said before we started recording that I'm planning for a trip to Peru later this year, and part of that preparation, I'm trying to get into the natural world a little bit, and I'm doing dream journaling as well. So it's been really fascinating for me to map the shifts in consciousness. So when I'm, say, sort of I'm also doing a bit of programming, computer programming in the morning. So I moved to that, and I've got a green tea, and I'm in rational analytical mode. And then you put that away for a bit, and you maybe go to wood for a while, and then you
Mhm.
start shifting away from that. I have to say it takes a little time, particularly if you're sort of locked in there. Um, and then you move to trying to write a dream diary at night, shifting between these states of consciousness. You become aware that actually what people take for granted as sort of the ground reality is very much modulated by our consciousness, but also the context. Our consciousness is
Mhm.
modulated by the context of what you're doing. So I was going to ask a slightly provocative question. I mean, because do you think there's an element of cultural bias in some of the work here? Because rational analytical states of mind are really favoured by our culture, and
Mhm.
liminal states of mind, I think it's perhaps better than it was, but often they really aren't.
No, I definitely think there is a bias, and I hope it's shifting. And you're seeing sort of. I mean, I'm living in a place where there's a lot of yoga and a lot of things like sound therapy and lots of conversations about psychedelics. And I think that's because it's a university town. Equally, you've got resistance to that, and this idea that rational and logical ways of thinking are best. Again, that is kind of a binary way of thinking. And I'm trying to sort of, I mean, I think it's really, really important to remember that all types of thinking are valuable for human flourishing, which is why, again, I try not to get into that. I can hear myself talking sometimes, and it sounds like, oh, I'm saying that the fluid, boundaryless ways of being are better. They are better for some things, but you do need to be able to move between modes of thinking. So we need to honor all ways of being and encourage all ways of being. But in order to do that, we do need to shed light on, altered states of consciousness and what they can tell us about humans and how we are in the world. And just like you're saying, like just noticing how you function differently in different places. And I was also thinking as you were talking about the act of walking because movement does it too. Again, we
Yeah.
forget that we're connected to our bodies and our bodies are connected to our ways of thinking. We are embodied. And so as we move around, particularly through nature, you're getting the benefit of physically moving as well that kind of shifts your consciousness and makes you more creative and probably more liminal to a certain extent. But yeah, I definitely
Yes.
we this can go into bigger conversations about, how parapsychology is viewed and how these whole areas are viewed. And I feel like, there's resistance still. There is resistance. It depends on the audience. And I think it depends on how you're talking about things. What I find is if you do present a balance and say, you are critical in your thinking and you say these experiences are part and parcel of being human and this is what they can do for people, and then I think people might listen a little bit more. I think that the conversation that's coming from psychedelics research is helping a little bit
Oh, good.
because yeah, I do, because I feel like there's a lot of funding in that research, and there's some really rich findings and theorizing coming out from the psychedelics research in terms of consciousness. And I think if you can say that there is legitimacy in certain types of experience, then and that's funded and visible, then that might kind of move the torch towards parapsychology. I suppose what I mean is that a lot of the research with psychedelics, is talking about mystical experiences, which has been studied by transpersonal
Yes.
psychologists for like ever. And you've got sort of hard nosed, mainstream neuroscientists measuring mystical experiences in the
Yes.
lab, doing brain scans. And so I think, there is a bias, but I feel like, that if that's coming out from within the materialist paradigm, that's really interesting. That's
Yeah,
a
yeah, yeah.
challenge.
It is. Although I have to say, I think there is some boundary guarding in that research, because
There
for
is.
writing the book, I reviewed an exchange in the Scientific American, I think, between Ed Kelly and Bernardo Kastrup and Robin Carhart Harris. And
Mm,
Ed Kelly and Bernardo were really trying to push the post-materialist, and Carhart Harris and et al. It was a sort of, they were going, no, our research has got nothing to do with that whatsoever. But I thought I find these binaries frustrating. I mean, for this
Yeah.
season, I've had a couple of professional skeptics on, which is great. I really like and appreciate the dialogue, but I find that the skeptic versus believer binary is very unhelpful these days. I mean, look at
Yes.
what we've been talking. We've been combining some
Hmm.
perhaps slightly, more of the parapsychological stuff with a lot of the new psychology and neuroscience. And I think I'm much more of a both and rather than
Hmm.
either or person. Uh,
Yeah, no, me too. And I think it's really important. Again, I feel like the older skeptics will hopefully die out eventually, that kind of way of thinking about, oh, all parapsychology is wrong. No, you need to be, we need to be both open. We need to be William James, really. We need to be William James. We need to let the data
yeah.
speak for themselves. We need to be really critical of what we're doing. We need to apply research from the mainstream to parapsychological phenomena, but and the other way too. But apply parapsychology back to mainstream research. We need to connect. Um,
Yes.
I get really frustrated with that old discourse about parapsychological versus psychological because we need both. We cannot progress with consciousness research without thinking about the full range of human experiences. But we shouldn't just kind of blindly accept them at face value. We have to try to understand them from multiple perspectives. And so I think that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to sort of be a skeptic and but be a true skeptic and really be open to everything. And everyone has their blind spots. I'm not saying I don't. I do. I do have my blind spots and I definitely have my own bubble threshold. But I'm trying to sort of, have those conversations with myself when I come to bubble thresholds. But you have to sort of think about everything, like all
Yes.
perspectives. Yeah, and
I
then you
mean,
learn something new. You learn something new, I think, at those edges.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the legitimate critiques that I'd like to see us try to address more from, it's Chris French, the first episode of the season, is that he can never get any positive results when he tries to. And I
Mm.
think the replication issue is still a significant one. For me, that's not enough to dismiss all of the positive results from parapsychology, because I think, well, you were doing Gansfeld experiments
Mhm.
at Northampton, were you? I got to see a
Yep.
couple of them.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I don't. I think if the skeptics are saying there's absolutely no evidence at all for parapsychology, I think that's just flat wrong. But at the same
Yeah.
time, I would like Chris French or whoever to go into a lab and be able to produce results as well. I'd like
Yeah.
anyone to be able to do it.
No, that would be really amazing. I think what will be profitable for the field is more research. Like there was a recent paper by Jim Horan and colleagues, and it was on remote viewing, and they were sort of acknowledging how skeptical they were about psi, and they did the research anyway, and it was a interdis. I think several authors on it, and they found some evidence for psi in the paper, and I just found it really exciting to read that. And I forget, it was a couple of years ago, maybe even last year. I was teaching a class on parapsychology and consciousness, and I just really appreciated it because there was, skeptics being willing to do the work anyway.
Mm.
But yeah, you're right. I think I see that happening over and over again. I mean, Sue Blackmore's another example. I
Yeah.
didn't find it, so I'm actually leaving the field. Okay, but you're really interested in consciousness. But if you can't find something yourself, does that mean there's no evidence for something? I mean, we don't do that with other areas of science. Oh, that a failed experiment. I don't think a failed experiment is a failed experiment anyway. You have to put your results into the bigger picture with any scientific discipline.
Mm.
And so,
And I think, yeah, absolutely. I think context is really important too. So we talked about hypnagogia. A lot of the
mhm,
time when they struggle to replicate it, like with the presentiment stuff, it's in a waking state of consciousness.
right.
And I think this stuff, this sounds like an excuse, I think, from the skeptical side, but I genuinely think this stuff hides and it
Yeah.
comes out in certain
It's true
specific
stuff.
circumstances.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do. I think there's some truth in that, because I mean, I've had a number of, I think, precognitive dreams, but were the strongest things that I've had. I don't think it's total nonsense, and I don't think it's just this misjudging probability. I do think there's something there, but I acknowledge that it's not something that's that easy to pin down.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I always joke about this with my students. I'm the queen of Piers point zero 0.06. I really am. Or Piers point zero 0.07. Um, I don't personally tend to find strikingly significant results myself, but I'm focusing on effect sizes and then how things work as a body of work. Um, and if there's anything to the experimental effect, that might kind of might sort of echo my own liminal status as a somebody who is a really a skeptical, open-minded person. I think psi does happen as well, but I think it's interesting that that's where my results are. But yeah, I think it's more complex than something, it's human. It's human. Psi is human and it's consciousness and it is tricks alike and it is liminal. And so I think the clues to looking at where psi emerges, and I'm going to say it like that rather than finding psi, is that it is part of a system. And we have to think about encouraging situations where the system will lead to psi emerging rather than finding psi. Because I think a lot of studies are, like, oh, looking here and looking here, but maybe we need to look in lots of places and have the right ingredients there for it to happen. Because, yeah, when I've had a couple of experiences, it's been about like intense meaningfulness, maybe in a dream state. So I'm thinking precognition. I think I've had an experience that I would say could be precognition. I don't know, could be a coincidence, but it felt meaningful and it was about kind of life circumstances and meaning and connection. And you can't always recreate all those things in a lab, but you can try to do some of those things. But yeah, I think there's definitely something. We have to look at the body of work, but we also need to think about, like, can we create a liminal system or a fractal system where we've got more likelihood of seeing psi occur. That's what I'd like to do.
Well, that sounds really a really constructive approach. I mean, I was thinking with your Gansfeld work at Northampton last spring, Chris Rowe did a summary of all of the Gansfeld work that's been done at Northampton, and they find persistent effects there
Yeah,
over
yeah,
experiments. So
yeah.
um,
But it's
it's
not
not always
perfect, but
effective.
it's something. It's something that's biasing people more towards um towards something, towards the information, because it goes from 1 in 4 to 1 in 3. That's a thing. That's a thing. So I think people expect psi to be perfect, but it's not. It won't be perfect, and it shouldn't be, maybe, because that's not how it works. It is about kind of unconscious biases, I think, towards certain things, and it is about meaning. Yeah, and it is about connection.
Do you think it's also got things to do with what kind of evidence you accept? Because it's like recently I saw a talk by this indigenous researcher, Natasha Tassel Matamua, who's from New Zealand, I think Maori, and she was talking about how they have done surveys on anomalous experience amongst indigenous people in New Zealand. And one of the most disturbing things was there seemed to be a tendency for sort of mainstream medicine, if you like, to pathologize some of these experiences. So bringing in ideas that we needed maybe to decolonize consciousness studies. And for me, that means we got to think about what kinds of evidence we can accept, or do we? You were talking about boggle thresholds. I
Mhm.
think maybe we all need to rethink slightly this very positivistic approach, which says it's just stats and p-values,
Right.
important though those are.
Yeah, they are. They're important for certain types of question, but I absolutely agree. I think we need to be diversifying how we look at research generally. because there is a movement in psychology towards more qualitative methods and mixed methods. And I think mixed methods are a really interesting way forward, and bringing attention back to the experiences themselves, and talking about the meaning making that's part of it, increasing those kind of approaches, but also some more innovative approaches as well. So a lot of the approaches from transpersonal psychology, and yeah, it's like different cultural perspectives. But we can expand how we're looking at these phenomena. I think things like the Parapsychology Association has a symposium coming up soon on cross-cultural approaches towards parapsychology. And I think we can learn from thinking about things in different ways. Carlos Alvarado was always talking about that as well. Like, we can't just assume that this one way of looking at things is the right way. So we need to, remind ourselves to look at multiple ways of knowing and bring that into the research. And yeah, so transpersonal methods are also about working with, rather than traditional research where there's a researcher working on the researched. Those kind of approaches, I think, can be quite valuable for these kind of phenomena as well, and empower people and the experiences. And then I suppose getting community members to do research, so citizen science approaches would also be really good here, to have lots of people doing the work rather than it being sort of shut away. I want the research to be done properly. So I really think it's really important for people to work together. And I think those kind of approaches would maybe open things up a little bit. Maybe. I hope so. I really do.
Yeah, yes, I do. I think it's important to open things up. I mean, I think one of Natasha's papers was on the role of privilege in near-death experience research, and I think this is one reasons why the believer versus skeptic thing tends to irritate me a little bit. It's because it's assumed that certain groups have a privileged access to the truth, and
Yeah.
I think that it closes the door to learning
Hmm.
from people who are perhaps marginalized.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. No, I think that I need to read that paper. That sounds really very interesting and important. Unfortunately, we don't see enough of those papers in journals, and that's a problem too. I mean, that we're not seeing all these different voices, but I think there's movements, and parapsychology could do this better. Like, just do things like this cross-cultural study day, and maybe special issues, looking at different ways of addressing things and naming the privilege. Absolutely. There was a there was also a study day a couple of years ago on feminizing the paranormal, and I was involved in that as well. So you just, need to be thinking about things in different ways. But, parapsychology is a small community, and I don't know how we can get that information out there, because I think people just have assumptions of what parapsychology is from the outside. And I don't know. I think we can try to kind of get things out into normal journals, but then the normal journals might be less sympathetic in some ways to the research. Not always, but that's why I think it's valuable to do these kind of bridging kind of projects where you are, connecting the dots between things. But sometimes I get frustrated because it is such a very small community, and yeah, people have biases about even looking at the work. Like, oh, or they don't even know there's a journal of parapsychology, or the JSPR. They don't know that. They haven't even looked there. They're just seeing somebody's blog. I'm like,
Yeah.
and it's really frustrating.
Yes, it's difficult, particularly on, say, social media, where there are all these different narratives are competing and claiming that they've got the truth. And I think for an outsider, I really do sympathise, because it's very difficult to judge who's legitimate, particularly in this sort of age where we're fighting misinformation and
Oh
all of
goodness.
this
Yeah.
this stuff. It makes it very difficult, I think, to try and to arrive at a sort of fair and rounded picture of what's going on. I mean,
Yeah.
it's one of the reasons why I was sort of doing this podcast, actually, because I'm hoping to get a
Yeah,
little bit this just out of not dissing journals, but sort of out of journal pages and a little bit discussed
yeah,
in a
yeah.
public space.
No, I think that is really important. I mean, just look at what's happened recently with the telepathy tapes. I mean,
Yeah.
the telepathy tapes is in the top 4, I think. So, people are obviously really intrigued by these experiences. And, I think it is hard to find the information. We know where to look as parapsychologists. We know exactly where to look. And, I am fortunate to be able to teach students who are really motivated about parapsychology and consciousness, and they know. But out there in the world, people have experiences, or they're thinking about things and they want to know. Where do they go? So yeah, I think a podcast is a really, really, really excellent idea, to sort of, present a more balanced perspective. But also, like, we do need to be writing perhaps books and other kind of media that allows for a more nuanced perspective that's kind of both open to sort of skeptical interpretations for some things and parapsychological interpretations for others, and some things that are both and. I think that's really important, and that's something that we can do. So
I mean, 100%. I mean, I, it was interesting you mentioned the telepathy tapes, because I've been seeing the usual highly polarized reactions. So there are either people who are just defending it, or there's the skeptical responses saying, no, of course autistic people are never telepathic, it's nonsense. And it's like the BBC, they only interviewed a skeptic and they didn't have, well, Chris Rowe on, and that's a very frustrating situation, because it means that you've got, again, these sort of the bubbles.
yes, the bubbles. The bubbles are so frustrating. Yeah, but to an extent, the media does. I mean, the media likes to polarize. Like, are you a believer or a skeptic? Yeah, I'm seeing that too. But I'm also, we're having our next meeting for the little research group that I run here is talking about the telepathy tapes at our next meeting. And I haven't listened to them all yet. I've listened to just really the first episode. I think research is fascinating, but again, I find myself going into a middle ground. There's no smoke.
Mm.
One, there's no smoke without fire. There's human experience. We start with human experience, and then we think about, okay, well, what is happening in the experience? What are the correlates? What do we know about the correlates? And I think there is something there, because autistic traits I've looked at a little bit in association with sensitivity, because sensitivity is more likely in autistic individuals, and synesthesia is something there. But then you can apply the skeptical lens as well and say, yes, the experiments might have flaws, because you've got people in the same room. We've learned a lot from the past from parapsychology, like with J.B. Rhine and his
Yeah.
horse. And that's what I immediately think. If you're in the same room and something seems to be too good to be true, maybe it is, but
Yeah.
we shouldn't just throw everything out. So what people should be doing is being inspired to look at the question more systematically, I think. And I know some detail. Yeah, some of that is happening. I think the people at Docs are going to be trying to do something. And then actually one of our students, one of our graduates, went on to do a PhD at University of Arizona in neuroscience. And he's, I think, going to be doing some work with Ian on, I think, we'll find out more soon. And he's got a really open mind from coming from West Georgia, but he's got the kind of neuro training. This is what we need, more people coming out like that are sort of jumping between worlds. Like, okay, here's hard neuroscience and here's parapsychology, and where can we look? Let's look with open minds.
Well, absolutely, and just to make it clear, I haven't looked at the telepathy tapes in any detail at all. It's mostly just been looking at articles or pieces that have been reacting.
Yeah.
It's on my to-do list. I've been extremely busy. It's simply that. But
Yeah.
I noticed, and I think this is what I find a bit frustrating, is that people make up their minds before they seriously look at it. So they think,
Yeah.
oh, I believe all of it, and then they write the blog or whatever. Or, oh, it's obviously all nonsense. This is just pseudoscience. and then they write their blog, and it's like there's no
Boxes.
systematic thing. The boxes again, the boundaries. There's no systematic thinking about it, and trying to do what you were just saying, which is break things up, try and introduce better controls if they're needed. Stuff. Hey, parapsychology has been doing for 150 years.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I've seen some very interesting conversations about the telepathy tapes in parapsychological circles that are skeptical. So I think that, again, like from the outside, there's an assumption that parapsychologists are not critical in their thinking, which is completely rubbish. If you actually know what the field is and how it's developed and how it's been self-critical, it's really narrow to think that. And I've seen that at some conferences as well, where there might be lots of mainstream people there. Some of the questions that are asked of parapsychologists assume a complete lack of knowledge of methodological standards.
Controls, or actually you've got to do randomization and all.
Show that, and actually parapsychology is at the forefront in that, which is not always known. But I see people immediately going back to kind of step one that maybe was happening in the 1930s when J.B. Rhine's research was first happening. But like a lot of that research, even in that era, evolved. For example, with moving people from the same room to different rooms. Of course, you realize things about subliminal priming and, but for me, I think subliminal priming is extremely fascinating. Anyway, all the normal explanations are extremely fascinating to me. And I think, we need to know more about those, as well as like where, they're not happening, or where they kind of speak to the psi, like in, Jim Carpenter's first sight model.
Yes.
Let's look at these kind of overlaps a little bit and shared correlates, and, like where's the mind processing something invisible? What's going on there?
It's really important, because I think there's, again, it's sort of this blurry line between what's so-called ordinary perception and what might be something that we think of as anomalous. I mean, for me, if you think of the universe as being fundamentally interconnected,
Yeah.
it's all going to be thrown in there, and so I think we maybe need to reframe a lot of these things, rather than again having these boxes of, oh, this is just anomalistic psychology, oh, this is parapsychology. I think it's psychology, but some of it might be psychology we don't understand very well at the moment. And
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, it is all psychology, because, at the end of the day, any psi experience is experienced by a person. It's psychological. So, it is psychological. And so this is where psychology can shed a lot of light. But I do really like it when people connect with other disciplines, with people people who are open-minded in other disciplines. Like, let's see, an example is Ed May's model with Sonali, neuroscience, physics. I mean, I would put more personality stuff in there and things from psychology as well, but that's interesting. That's really interesting.
And I think another of the guests that I've had is John Taylor, who has a very similar model, that it's all precognition, but they're really trying to nail down the parameters of things like of remote viewing. So I think it's things like contrast in targets, and I'm thinking, if they're doing that and successfully getting results, there has to be something going. It's psychological, but there has to be something real there.
Yeah, no, there is. I think if you look across the board, particularly with ESP research, I think there are interesting patterns that are strongly suggestive. There is some non-local consciousness. There is something, or there's evidence for psi. There is evidence for psi. I don't know. I think some of it is working differently than others. Like, so I was really excited about Julia Mossbridge's understanding of different types of precognition. And some of it's more kind of physically based, and some of it might be more about, something that is in a sort of perhaps different field or different dimension. But yeah, you can start then trying to sort of make more sense of things, breaking them down, looking at how they're working differently, as well as overall evidence for psi. But yeah, like if you look across everything, I think there are certainly shared correlates and characteristics. And I think we can learn from those from a psychological perspective, and that can lead to other theorizing about what else might be going on.
Mm. Yeah, it remains such a fascinating field of consciousness. So you don't regret entering and being a professional parapsychologist then,
Not
and
at all.
psychologist.
No, I love it. I mean, it's like it's I get frustrated when I can't dedicate enough time to thinking about this stuff and doing the research. I'm in a teaching institution, so a lot of my time is spent teaching and doing admin. It's a public institution in the States, which means, I am doing research, but there's less time to do research. So I get frustrated that I can't do more. But then there's a lot of excitement through teaching, and I'm in a place where I get to teach classes where I can talk about parapsychology. So sometimes I might find inspiration for research in the classroom and with the students. And I am doing research, and I feel like there's always the next thing to do. So I'm still, I've got lots of things on my to-do list that all connect with my origins, I suppose, like in hypnagogia when I was an undergrad. Everything does connect. So I'm still doing research on, healthy versus less healthy exceptional experiences, and trying to sort of look more at what is the nature of this trait, and looking at sensitivity and synesthesia is one of the big things I've been looking at in recent years. ASMR, which I think is a form of synesthesia, that is another thing that needs to be looked at. No, I never regret it. It's like there's always like a whole list of things. I'm doing too much, honestly. I'm always doing too much because I'm always like juggling lots and lots of things at once, and thinking about what to do next to make sure that I can fuel the fire, I suppose, because there's just a lot of things still to do, I believe. It's just a lot still to
Brilliant. And I think there's such a public interest in it as well. I mean,
Yeah.
just before Christmas, my sister took me to the Uncanny live in the Royal Festival Hall, and I think it's
Robbins?
Danny Robbins. That's it. Danny
Yeah,
Robbins
there
was saying he'd the year before they'd had a very small audience for their
Oh, really?
festival, and then yes, 2025 it's absolutely huge. And
Oh,
one of the
wow.
one of the authors who'd written a book on the ghosts of Borley Rectory was a crime writer, and he'd said he'd approached his publishers about 10-15 years before, and they'd said, oh, there's no audience for ghost books.
Yeah, there is now. No, and it's so compelling. I mean, everybody has a story. I think that's where that podcast and the show is really sort of appealing to people, because even if you are skeptical, you might still have an experience, or your dad has an experience, or your friend has an experience, and they're just really cool stories. Like whatever you do with them next, they are really cool stories. And so this is again like, going back to what we were saying before about, you doing the podcast, and how do we get the information to people? That's, if you can do it in the right way, you can really draw public attention, and then hopefully that can then lead to new research, because really that's what we need. We need to know more. But I do think the stories in themselves are really, really compelling. Yeah, like with the ghost stuff, I just got a contract for a book on ghosts, and I didn't. Yeah, I think even a few years ago, I didn't think that would happen. But it's like, oh, okay. But I'm trying to do the same. I'm trying to do like psychology and parapsychology in the same book, and we'll see where that goes. But I think it is really timely, and people are interested, and they want to know more. But just we need to be able to have more knowledge to be able to give it back as well, I think, as we go forward.
Yes. So when's this book going to come out?
Haha. It's supposed to be coming out. Well, I'm supposed to be finishing it August 2026. So I have to make a start on it. Yeah. I mean, actually, it's something that does align with a course I've taught here. So that's where it comes from, because I was always like steering away from the survival hypothesis. I was not necessarily consciously, but I was always more interested in You mentioned the Gansfeld and, psi research, ESP. I've done a lot of work with ESP and really sort of thinking about experiences of the living, but I started getting lots of people coming to me with ghost stories, and we did a psychomantium study here at West Georgia, and I just got really interested in the psychology and parapsychology of ghosts. Again, like actually partially inspired by a graduate student who was here, and he was involved um, in the inception of that psychomantium study. Anyway, so I suppose that, and then we can have some academic freedom here. So I proposed the course on psychology of ghosts, and I think the book is going to align with a lot of uh, that course. So I would start off talking about the experiences and the family tree of ghosts and the different correlates, because that is my passion. I feel like we get into a lot of the experiences by looking at these correlates, and then we move into like different ways to understand the experiences, and from normal, psychological, and other perspectives, and then considering some of the other psi related understandings, and then some that are a little bit of both.
Brilliant.
Yeah, so I'm excited. I just, my concern is not having enough time, but that is my life. I'm a busy person, but I like being busy. Busy is good.
Well, I think we're sort of drawing to the close of the discussion, but you've already explained what you're sort of just about to be working on. Do you have any wishes for the future, or sort of the immediate future, for parapsychology?
I just wish there was more funding bodies like Bial. I'm grateful to Bial. I am so happy that Bial emerged as a funding body. Um, but what I see is like a lot of people trying to battle for the same pot of money. I think I'd like to see, if there were more funding bodies, that would be good, but that's a big wish. More doable things of parapsychology are to have more people working together, perhaps. We've had skeptic proponent collaborations in the past, but you know, things like the paper I mentioned earlier, the Haran paper, like, get people together and do some studies. Even if you're skeptical, maybe work with people who find results, and just maybe see what we can do and ask the questions. I think those kind of collaborations are going to be really important, even if there are null findings. That's still a finding. It's
Yeah.
still a finding. Looking at correlates is my thing, because I feel like it gives us clues. It just gives us clues psychologically and in terms of psi. Maybe we can also start being more vocal about what parapsychological research tells us about consciousness. Um,
Yes.
you know, I mean, being more vocal and grounded. I think, again, like it's easy for people to look in and say, oh, those are really flaky, old fashioned ways of thinking. No. And people are not black and white thinking in what they think consciousness is either. But we can certainly critique materialist models and say, okay, something else might be going on, or talk about the limits of materialist models at least. And,
Mm.
I don't know. So maybe some more consciousness books from parapsychologists would be good too.
Yes. I, I I think that's a
Yours.
really strong point. Yes. Oh, I hope
Nice
so.
book.
I really hope I hope so. I think that if there's one take-home point, is that what we're talking about is such a vast field of human experience that is consciousness related, that I think just dismissing it as sort of cognitive delusions and hallucinations is
Absolutely.
really superficial.
Yeah. No, it really is superficial. It's like, oh, let's just ignore that these experiences happen. I mean, what I always say is, okay, well, we're studying, every psychology undergraduate studies schizophrenia that happens in 1% of the population. And then there's all these other types of experience that are happening in, like significantly higher proportions. So I think ESP experience is about like 40%, and in some surveys anyway. This is a significant proportion of people. If you ask people about life after death and their beliefs in that, that's like into 70%. These are human concerns, and everybody's thinking about what happens when they die. So we need to be, we need to be looking at this systematically and not just getting into beliefs. Do the
Yeah,
research.
absolutely. Well, that's brilliant, Christine. So, if people are interested, where can they find your work?
That's a very good question. So I need to think about that. And I've got some publications out there. I don't actually have a proper website yet, but I need to get one perhaps.
Well,
I was lying. There is my website that's trying to educate the public, but it's not really about my work. It's trying to sort of dispel myths about exceptional experiences. So that's called Exceptionalia. So that's one place where I'm trying to assemble a lot of my thoughts on things. And really, it was designed, to educate and to sort of support people who might be having, some disturbance around their experiences. So it's like, okay, well, what is this experience? Am I crazy? Here's where to go, that kind of thing. But yeah, I think University of West Georgia is where I am. The psychology program has parapsychology at all 3 levels. It is just all in person, so it is Georgia, USA. But yeah, I'm trying to get my stuff out there as quickly as I can with all my other commitments.
well, that's brilliant. So, thank you so much, Christine. It's been a very illuminating chat, and I hope you've enjoyed it.
I have enjoyed it. It's really nice to see you, Matt.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
What Lies Beyond with your host, Matt Coburn. Conversations on consciousness science, the paranormal, and the post-material future. This podcast accompanies the What Lies Beyond book by Matt Coburn, now available for pre-order on Amazon. Visit us and subscribe on whatliesbeyond.substack.com.